meetings are held
Oh,
at
there,
CBS
CBS, okay.
in a 1950s era rehearsal hall
Oh, cool.
with the dance bar on the side for the dancers to variety shows.
Cool.
Is that what that's for? I've always wondered because it seems so strange.
That building has incredible history. And I always go through and they have these little cages, you know, where they try to have people moving around. And I'm like, how cool this building is. Like the oldest building is 105 years old. That building was, underneath the building is a secret catacomb. Literally, it's a catacomb. And there's an Amtrak platform underneath the building. See, because it was a dairy. And before refrigeration, they would bring the milk down from upstate. And in that building, process it and distribute it as there was no refrigeration. So it's like literally just in time distribution.
I was just at an event, part of the SBA design for this system.
That is so.
Electricity in these really teeny rooms and.
So if you ever find them on CBS or asking if they've been to RR level.
Okay.
Before they
Unsolved.
reactivated that Wi-Fi,
This is Calvin shooter.
there were people living.
Calvin's the front, so we can hand things from one hand to the next.
We'll put the hand mic on, because actually the sound doesn't travel. Okay, we'll chat out. Do we have any people for you here? Yeah, so just in case I was introduced. It's Manoush here.
Okay, I want to welcome you guys this morning. My name is Justin Hendricks. I'm Executive Director of NYC Media Lab. And you were at the first, just a prototype event, very much so with WNYC. The first effort is sort of doing what we're going to call this Geek of the Month series, which we want to be a casual series, allow us to introduce you to some of the great work that's happening on New York City's campuses in various schools across various disciplines. So we're very excited about this one and very grateful to the RGA Accelerator and RGA for hosting this event with us this morning, and grateful to WNYC and Manoush for doing the work of learning about this subject and moderating the discussion this morning. And she'll talk a little bit more about her show and about New Tech City and tell you a little bit more about what they're up to these days. But because this is meant to be a networking opportunity, I would like everyone to stand up and please shake the hand of someone you don't know who's sitting right next to you. There
I think of all the places to be from, right? Because I toured, right? But I work on a company called Manoush. We work on
Okay. So now there's going to be some coffee left over and some opportunity. You now all have a new friend, and I hope that you will talk with one another after the session. So just briefly for anybody here who doesn't know NYC Media Lab, we're a consortium of NYU and Columbia. We work with various other institutions of higher education across the city and with member companies, some of which are here today, like Time Warner Cable, HBO, ESPN, and others, on innovation projects, connecting them with faculty and students on the campuses of New York City in order to kind of drive create new technologies and hopefully create some innovations along the way. So if anybody's interested in New York City Media Lab and what we do, feel free to grab me, my colleague Julia, who has put this event together today, and we're happy to tell you more about that. I want to take a moment to introduce Calvin Chu, who's going to tell you about what's happening in this space. And Calvin Chu is Managing Director here at the RGA Accelerator. I'm going to let him take the mic and tell you what's happening.
All right. Thanks, Justin. So I'm Calvin Chu, the Managing Director here at RGA Accelerator. And I'm just thrilled to have is this the first Geek of the Month, actually?
Yes.
Amazing. So I'm glad that all of you come out. And for those who are new to RGA Accelerator, we are a Techstars operated accelerator that focuses specifically in connected devices. So these are Internet of Things companies that is in the fastest, hottest growing area of hardware. And we're one of we're probably the only accelerator in New York that focuses just on Internet of Things. So that's really the key for us here. And we've just did our demo day and ended the first program, and to a lot of really great fanfare and media in New York. And I think that we're really thrilled with the result. And if you're new, we invest and host 10 startup companies every year here at the accelerator, and work on building them up into really great companies. And also pleased to have John here, who is who's from Columbia University. He's not only a great scientist and a professor, but he's also an entrepreneur and mentor to startups, including mentoring the startups here at RJ Accelerator. He's come here for office hours and has been very helpful to all my companies here. So I'm pleased for that. And not only that, over the past few years, he's been instrumental in founding and nurturing a number of the most innovative startups, hardware startups in New York City. Companies like Lumiode and Radiator Labs, Chromation, and that's important because he's contributing to a diverse and vibrant New York City hardware startup ecosystem. And compared to San Francisco, we might not have as many startups as the Bay Area, but we're closing that gap really fast. Thanks to our efforts here, Columbia's efforts, and I think as of current, we're hosting some of the most major companies in the hardware space in New York City. So companies like Adafruit and Quirky, Kickstarter, MakerBot, right? Square, Canario, all these new startups and startup ecosystem companies are building up headquartering here in New York, and it's kind of the sign that New York is rapidly accelerating into a spot on the global stage for hardware. And don't want to take up too much more time, but I'll just mention two things. The first is RRE Ventures does its infamous New York City Startup Guide, and in mid-program they've updated the guide and added this accelerator to their list, which is really fantastic because it's the closest thing to a who's who in the startup in the New York startup world for us. And they've also listed several of our companies in that guide, and they've added hardware as one of the new up and coming verticals that New York is known for. So that's just thrilling. And last thing is, besides all the press that we've been getting, we got one more lately that named the top 9 connected devices startups in New York City, and all of these companies are from this accelerator. All right, so with that, I want to get started by introducing Manoush and John, and please give them a welcome onto the stage.
Alright, this is going to be John's show. We know you have a busy day ahead of you, so we're going to keep it pretty tight here. I'm Manoush Zomorodi. I'm the host of WNYC's New Tech City. My job is to make things that can be kind of complicated to those of us that don't gravitate towards this stuff very easily, make it accessible, make it interesting, help people understand how much technology is truly changing the way they live, the way they work on a daily basis. And so when Julia and Justin were like, how about, John, like, let's talk about thin film electronics. I was like, okay. It terrified me, and that's why I knew we had to start this way. Because I feel like if it terrifies me, that means it terrifies other people, and that we don't understand it fully. So I'm going to turn it over to John. He has brought show and tell stuff. We're going to pass stuff around. This is your chance to immerse yourself in a safe space. So John's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have Q&A after that. And no question too dumb. I warned him that I would be asking the dumbest questions, so you feel free to take it up a notch if you need to. And I'm going to turn it over to John from here. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. I'm not sure if I should sit or not, but I'll give it a shot. So I'm John Kymissis from Columbia University, and I'm going to speak today about kind of the focus of our research, which I like to call electronics on anything. And so I guess when we talk about electronics today, probably the most important invention in electronics in the last 100 or so years has been the transistor. And the transistor is really the core of all electronic systems. And at their heart, transistors are just switches. So they allow us to apply a signal to one spot and then have something happen at another spot. And you can use them as digital switches, so they can be all the way on or all the way off, but more often they wind up acting in a way in which you can use them to control an analog value. There's a lot of discussion about how many transistors you need to load worldwide, et cetera. But in the end, transistors let us do math, but they can also be used to control power, to manage the flow of electricity, and to do other really interesting things. So, where do transistors show up? Most people don't handle transistors on a daily basis. And if we take a modern electronic system like an iPad apart, there are a few different parts. So most of the iPad winds up being taken up by the battery, which is this pouch here. There's a display and some magic in the front. But there's this circuit board here, which is the size of a few pieces of gum. And on this circuit board are a number of chips. And inside those metal and plastic packages are where the silicon lives. And each one of those has millions or billions of transistors on it. So in the most recent iPad, for example, the central controller had about 1 billion transistors. And memory chips have several billion transistors each. So all of these chips, we call them also integrated circuits, they have lots of transistors working together. So where do these come from? Well, they're made from silicon. Silicon makes up a huge fraction of the Earth's crust, and so it's mined. There are various ores that can be refined to make silicon. But in the end, what winds up happening is that silicon is purified, it's put into a big bowl, melted, and then by putting in a seed and pulling it out very carefully, it's possible to make enormous single crystals of the silicon material. So this is called a boule, and so these are huge tubes that weigh now tons, or maybe half a ton or so. And then these are sliced up, and we build all of our transistors on those layers. And so there's a relatively complicated process, a very simplified sort of schematic of one way you could do it. But basically, we take those slices, which we call wafers, process them, we heat them in ovens, add some impurities, grow some stuff on top. And in the end, we wind up with these very fancy integrated circuits, which form the heart of most modern electronics. And this is done at a huge scale. So just to give you an idea, this is an aerial photograph of a new factory that's about 2.5 hours north of here, just next to Albany, built by Global Foundries, which produces these integrated circuits. And it cost about $3 billion to put together. So the whole discussion is the cafeteria of this factory costs as much as most other factories alone, right? So it's huge, huge economic scale that this is able to operate at. This is a photo of what the inside sort of looks like. This is a picture from another New York State facility. This is from IBM's Fishkill lab, which is a little bit older technology, but it's going to look a lot like this. Basically, you see a lot of machines. You don't see a lot of people. The people that are there are just fixing things. But there's a robotic system, which you can't see in this picture, that moves cassettes of these wafers around. And one machine might clean the wafer, another machine might heat it, another adds some impurities, another grows films. And there are lots of machines. And there wind up being a few hundred steps, starting from that giant single crystal and ending with an IC. And you can see a picture here from Intel. And I have a friend of mine from IBM gave me a couple wafers here, so we can pass this around. So this gives you an idea of where our electronics come from. So we chop this up, and we funnel all the signals in. Magic happens on the transistors, and then that signal comes out, and that'll go through pass around item. So one of the kind of interesting things about using silicon to make electronics is that when we process these wafers, it basically costs the same if we make 1 million transistors or 1 billion transistors on the same substrate. So this has created an economic drive to shrink the size of everything that's on there. Because if you can make the transistors half the size, you can now pack 4 times as many on the wafer and make more money. And this has led to an effect which people call Moore's Law, and we can debate whether it was a prediction or an observation or whatever, but it's effectively a self-fulfilling prophecy, which tells us that the improvement in the number of transistors that we have on an integrated circuit, as well as the size of each of those transistors, improves exponentially. And so since the beginning of Moore's Law, which is about 40 years ago, till now, we've had about a 10 to the 9th decrease in the cost per transistor that we see in devices. And we'll hit 10 to the 10th relatively soon. So just to give you an idea, in 2010, we hit a threshold where making a transistor costs less than the ink used to print a single letter on a piece of paper. And there are lots of other projections we made. It's almost unimaginable just how powerful integrated circuits are. So they're great at doing computation, they're great at power handling, doing image compression, image expansion, audio handling, all that stuff. Now, everything's getting cheaper and it's more powerful because it's getting smaller. But all of the visions that we have of the future are not of us trading these tiny little chips, right? except maybe for the diamond age or some other kind of dystopian future. Whenever we think about the connected future, we think of large displays, we think of walking in interactive environments, we think of electronics that scan us and understand our bodies and understand our physiology. And silicon is amazing, and it's going to be a part of the future, no doubt, and it's going to be an increasing size of the global economy as that moves forward. But what my group asks, and groups that work on what we work on, is there really more to electronics than just making everything really small and really fast? And the answer to that question is, we think so, probably, maybe, I don't know. But one way to start to approach this question is to look beyond silicon, to look beyond crystal and semiconductors. So the wafer that we passed around, it's big, but the chips are only cheap because we can make them really small. What happens if we want to make electronics that are large? It's also single crystal, so it's relatively brittle. And there are some tricks you can use to delaminate the single crystal, but they don't take you all that far. What we can do instead of carving, starting with the perfect single crystal and carving transistors out, is there are semiconductors which we can deposit and are active, even if the substrate itself is something inert, like glass or plastic, or that we can deposit onto other active materials. These semiconductors, and there are several families of them, are known as thin film semiconductors. And they're called that because you don't start with the semiconductor the way you do with silicon. You start with something that we'll just call the substrate, and then we build the electronics on top. And what's really powerful about this is it gives us the power to put electronics on nearly anything. So we can start with something that has other properties we're looking for, and then add those semiconducting or other electronic properties. And there's been a lot of work on thin film semiconductors. There are a lot of functionalities that we can kind of pull out of our toolbox, so that we can make light emitters, photodetectors, solar cells, transistors, piezoelectric materials. All sorts of stuff is available in thin film format. And what we work on is grabbing the pieces that we need and putting them together. I'll show a few examples in order to make systems that do something new and do something exciting. Now you might ask, if thin films are so great, why haven't most people heard of them? Well, there's one area where thin film electronics is really dominant, and that's in displays. So liquid crystal displays like this monitor have millions of thin film transistors on them, on the piece of glass which is in the back. And this is a micrograph of the current generation iPod Nano display. A friend of mine who dismantled it took some photos for me. And you can see that there's a transistor here which connects to the liquid crystal pixel flag. And these are just acting like switches. So this allows you to select the individual pixel elements which are inside the display. And this is a pretty big business. So this is about $150 billion a year business in making active matrix crystal displays. And that's the one area where thin film devices have made a huge impact. And you can already see how it would be difficult to take wafers like the one we're passing around and make displays that are this big. And modern display factories use glass, which is, I shouldn't even open my hands, about 3 meters on an edge. So I'm not tall enough to do that. 3 meters on an edge, and again, huge scale and huge economy there. So the first system I'll talk about, which we've been working on, is combining transistors together with piezoelectric films. And so the device that we've been developing is an active matrix microphone. It's a collaboration with Lisa Olson, who's at the Medical Center at Columbia. And the idea is to make a microphone which has a high spatial resolution so that we can look at sound. Sound is kind of cool because the wavelength of sound is about the same size as us. So low frequency sound is about 1 meter. High frequency sound is a couple millimeters. And so to make this microphone, we've been using a material which is a piezoelectric polymer. So it's a plastic sheet which, when you apply a pressure or stretch it, generates a charge. And there are a number of systems that use this as a single microphone, but we've been interested in making arrays on here. And the way that we do it is we add switches to the piezoelectric polymer material. And there are actually 2 different kinds of switches that we put on. One type that routes all of the signals, and a second type that takes the charge and converts it into different forms. It takes it from a charge and converts it into a current so that it strengthens the signal so that we can pull it out. And so with that combination, there's lots of magic that goes in and a lot of processing that we do. We have a great facility at Columbia for doing semiconductor processing. We can make a system that looks like this, and I actually brought some samples we can pass around. This is the second little thing. We can make a system, it looks like a piece of plastic, but it's actually a microphone. The plastic itself is the sensor, and then we instrument it with just enough switching and amplification capability in order to make this microphone. And we can do a couple fun things with it. So this is an example of it measuring airflow by looking at the noise that is caused by the air passing over the surface. And you can see where the air hits, and you can map the jets and look at turbulence and some things like that. And we can also measure sound directly, take a picture of what sound looks like. And so this is an example of that same system, but instead now we have a speaker at 13 kilohertz, and we've rigged it so that we can now measure the wavelength of sound directly. It's something which you could imagine doing with hundreds of little microphones. We're able to do it using a single monolithically fabricated system. Now, one area that we're working on applying this is to measure the pressure wave which is inside the ear. And so we've also made a very tiny version of this, which is about 150 microns in diameter. And recently we were able to insert it into a rodent ear and then measure what that pressure wave in the cochlea looks like. And that's something that we're developing into a system that we hope can be useful for both placing cochlear implants and then eventually making a new type of system that would work that way. But all based on the same kind of hardware. So a second example that I'll show is sort of the reverse, where we're going to take another magic plastic sheet and then add transistors to it. And this is a material which is an electrorestrictive polymer. And I'll show a very short video, which is of this material in action. And so this is a real-time video of the, when it runs. There we go. So this is the material moving. And it moves in response to an electric field. This is a pretty amazing material that was developed at Penn State, which is a combination of 3 different monomers in this complicated polymer. And so we're able to draw sheets of it, put electrodes on, and then we laminate those sheets together. And it gives us a significant macroscopic movement. So people see this, they get very excited. I went and showed it to program manager, he got really excited until he saw what we had to do, which is that this only works when we apply 500 volts to it, and that's a little scary to most people. So he kind of laughed at me and he said, well, okay, that's not going to happen. So what we decided to do, and we got some support from DARPA to work on, is to put transistors on and to essentially set up switches so that we would have one switch. So we apply the 500 volts once, and then we can have a switch which connects the active area to the 500 volts when we want to turn it on, and then another switch which discharges it from the 500 volts when we want to turn it off. And again, we set it up, and there's a whole bunch of processing. This is what it looks like when we make it. And so in the end, we can control it at a low voltage, so around 30 volts, but have it manage the 500 or 450 volts for us. And so we now we have a system which we can control at relatively rational voltages, which gives us that macroscopic deformation. Excuse me, that macroscopic deformation in the system. And so it's sort of the reverse of the microphone in that we can now take a system, apply some voltage to it, and then have the polymer muscle do some work. So another example of this sort of combination is putting together organic light-emitting diodes with organic photodetectors. And in this case, we're working with a group at Cornell with Hung Tao Ma and Ted Schwartz, a very talented team. And they, in particular, are looking at mapping the blood flow in the brain. And this is an interesting problem because the brain is very tightly vasoregulated. So the blood vessels in the brain are very closely attuned to how hard the neurons are working. So if there's an area of the brain which is working harder, the blood vessels open up a little bit to provide more blood. And if a part of the brain is not working so hard, the blood vessels tighten up to free up capacity for the other parts of the brain. Now, because the blood is a different color than the brain, you can look at the color, and this color change is subtle, but it's measurable. You can look at what the color is on the surface of the brain and figure out where there's activity and where there isn't activity. And in particular, what the Cornell folks have shown is that you can use this to map epileptic seizures. So when you have somebody opened up and you're trying to figure out where to cut exactly to cut the feedback loop that forms seizures, today it's all guesswork. But what they're able to do, and this is a picture of it, is they can create a map of where the seizure travels, and then from there predict where surgery would be most effective. The problem is that the skull has to be open, and that's somewhat limiting from a diagnostic approach. So we've developed a system, which I'll pass around some samples from, which is extremely thin. It's a 1 micron thick, so it's about a 25th the thickness of a sheet of paper. And it has 2 different devices built directly on it. One of them is an organic light-emitting diode, and so that emits light. And then we also have organic photodetectors built into it. And so we can shine light and see how much of that light gets bounced back, and from there determine how much blood flow there is in different sections of the brain. And it turns out that this has a higher spatial resolution than trying to measure that same signal electrically. When you do it electrically, unfortunately, the cerebrospinal fluid is very conductive, and so the signal spreads pretty broadly. Now, we make it really thin for 2 reasons. One is that the thinner sheet clings to the surface of the brain, and so we don't get the cerebrospinal fluid trapped underneath, which complicates the optics. But it also cuts down on wave guiding that otherwise happens. And so you'll see when you pass it around, it's extremely, it's very much like saran wrap, although we coat it with some materials to keep it from having too much of the static that otherwise would trap it together. And then the last one that I'll just highlight is something that's moved out of my group and has started a small company Calvin mentioned, Lumiode, which is taking these thin film transistors and combining them with light-emitting diodes. Light-emitting diodes are pretty amazing. Everyone's been to Times Square and has seen the huge displays that are made using LEDs. But those displays are made using discrete LEDs. So you take a crystal, kind of like the silicon crystal, but using materials that emit light, cut those up into millions of little pieces, and then those are put in big arrays in Times Square. But LEDs, even though they're very bright and very efficient, aren't generally directly used in displays. And that's because there's no currently known way to chop up an LED into millions of little pixels and then control each one individually. So our approach to dealing with this is to start with an LED. And LEDs are very bright and they're very efficient. So modern LEDs are about as bright as the sun. And so there's a lot of light available there. But you need a lot of current. And then we have a strategy using some technologies that were developed at Columbia and James Im's group to add transistors to those LEDs to then get active control of each of these individual elements. And so these are actually really fresh pictures from last week showing what some of the test structures look like. So we have little individualized LEDs, and then we're able to build transistors together with them and create that control. So this makes a display that's extremely bright and in principle would be the most efficient display that's ever made. So just with this brief intro, I hope I've convinced you silicon electronics are amazing, and what they do is unbeatable, and they've really transformed everything about the world. But thin film electronics give us the power to make other stuff as well, which is complementary to what silicon can do. We can make stuff that's bigger, we can make stuff that's more flexible, we can make things that are on the size scale that we exist and that we can interact with. And with this kind of hybrid integration approach where we can mix and match devices, we can really make the systems of the future. So always I have to emphasize that I don't do any real work. My students do the work. And so I have to thank them for their extreme hard work and the folks that pay the bills, especially government funding agencies and some companies we work with. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, so like I said, we can go back, we can review if you have a question. It's all good here. I want to start out by asking, to me, I deal mostly with consumer stuff, right? And we're talking about wearables all the time, and you mentioned that you get funding from DARPA. Is that really sort of some of the most exciting places that we can see this being used, at least in terms of, capturing like lay people's imagination, like they can conceptualize of what the possibilities are?
Yeah, so, well, I'll just say the funding agencies have their own agendas. So you get on with NSF, Department of Energy. You'd be surprised what they actually give us the money to do.
Tell us.
The idea, and this never really took off, and I criticize so much, but the idea for the electrostrictor was to try to build a X-ray system that had no moving parts but could take tomographic X-ray.
What's a tomographic X-ray?
So today, when you go in for a CAT scan,
Yep.
that's computer-assisted tomography.
Yep.
So what all that means is it takes thousands of pictures from different angles and then puts them together to figure out what's going on. And that involves these really complicated machines with like super high-strength steel, fast-moving parts. So the challenge, and this is one that hasn't yet been addressed, was can you get rid of that giant rotating part and instead put a whole bunch of detectors on the outside? The answer is yes, but you don't get quite enough views. So the hope was to put the detectors and have something that could just wiggle them a little bit in a really predictable way. And that's what we were working on it for.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, now back to what my original, like, 'cause
Yeah.
my kid wants to know, like, will I be able to, the cochlear implants, things like that. Are
Yeah.
we talking about, like, this is where we could potentially see it in the
I think so,
supermarket?
absolutely. I think, the cochlear implants is an area that's really ripe for innovation. When cochlear implants came out, it was just, there's nothing else like it.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, oh no, rodent. Like, that's like the teeniest little ear you've ever seen, right?
No,
I mean,
you'd be
it's-
surprised. Actually, rodents have huge ears.
Oh, yeah, but the canal, I mean.
No. So hamsters, guinea pigs, the ears are almost as big as a human.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're all here.
Oh, so they provide
Yeah.
accessibility. They're all here. Okay.
They're actually an excellent test subject because of that. So that's why our collaborators use them.
All right. If anybody has a question, this is Cash.
Yeah.
There is a microphone right here. If you want to ask anything, please. If you want to press him on the DARPA stuff, please do.
Hi, I don't know if this is on. Yeah. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm curious, this stuff, I can't help but think about 3D printing at home. And is it possible in the future we'll be able to print out thin film stuff that we would apply to, could we make our own stuff?
Oh, absolutely. And actually, printing is used to make a lot of this stuff. So I kind of flipped past it very quickly, but our microphone is partially printed. So this thing that you see on the bottom, this white box, is a really cool system that was loaned to us from HP, and it's a poor man's inkjet printer, which you could load your own inks into. And so that was part of the system. Absolutely, making this in a fully printed format is entirely possible today. We actually have a project. It's not making the microphone, but making chemical sensors using all printing techniques, very similar to what we did here, is possible. And that's one of the nice things about organic semiconductors in particular. We use one of the families of these thin film materials, organic semiconductors. Many of them can be printed. Printing metal is a solved problem. That's actually pretty easy. And we can print a number of active materials, piezoelectric materials as well as semiconductors, light emitters, photodetectors, solar cells. And that's a very active area of research.
That's cool. I should say your name. Tell us who you are, because I feel like we're family after this, right?
Oh no, is it that hard?
Hi, I'm Maddie. I'm working out of the Visible Futures Lab over at the School of Visual Arts. And we've been exploring electronics quite a bit. And I've heard often that a big complaint when it comes to Moore's Law and advancing technologies, that software as well as battery power isn't keeping up with the advancement of transistors, for example. And within that, the iPad is restricted to a certain size because of the battery required to go inside. We can't always use all of our computing power because of operating systems. What's the biggest barrier that you're finding when it comes to thin film electronics and making that commonplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I'm working with David Ahola at SVA on a project in energy harvesting, which is very appropriate to your question. Getting the power in and out, that's often the biggest problem. We can put all sorts of magic functionality in, but in the end, you'll see all this stuff has wires attached to it, and thin film electronics aren't yet good enough to provide radios or to have wireless power transfer, but I think that's one of the big frontiers. And if you're interested in the topic, can I show an event?
Yeah, totally.
Next Friday at Columbia. We're going to have an all-day workshop specifically on this question, and one of the speakers will be Naveen Verma from Princeton, who's precisely looking at that question. How do you, for example, cut one of the cords by doing wireless power transfer to thin film and flexible systems.
And presumably you're thinking of it in fashion terms, maybe, or like what? I don't know what you're.
Yeah, when it comes to tactile engineering specifically, but just electronics as a broader field, it's interesting to see what's restricted by other concepts.
Yeah.
I would say connectivity is one of our biggest constraints, and then that relates both to communication and power. Silicon does a great job at putting radios on, and so you'll see sometimes people just tack a little radio in the corner, and maybe that's okay. But I'd love to see thin film radios really take off, which needs more work.
Yeah. There and in the back, great. You want to go all the way?
So I work with Manoush at WNYC. I had a question. I'm looking at the muscular one. Clearly, that would be the idea of implanting perhaps some people who have lost muscle use to generate the ability to control the muscle. Theoretically, that would have to have some sort of connection to brain direction. Is there? I said that right. Is there any ability or any look in terms of the power question, or is there exploration of powering it through? Maybe this is a super naive question, but in powering it through the human body and the energy that's generated as well, so you don't need wireless transfer, that you don't need to be plugged into a battery pack?
Yes, this is no. This is an area of great research, and there was a very exciting paper about a year and a half ago from Manoush and the Confidence Group, looking at this question, for example, for cochlear implants, so for stuff that you might put in your ear. It turns out that there's a different ion concentration on the inside and on the outside of the cochlea, and they were able to build a system which used that as a battery, and using some kind of fun electronics, take advantage of that ionic gradient in order to generate power. There are other groups, one of my colleagues at Columbia, Ken Shepard, is looking at taking the same proteins that are in the cell membranes of your mitochondria and putting those into synthetic membranes to do the similar sort of thing. I think that day is coming. It's a great question and an area of some active research.
Burn more calories that way, right?
Exactly, right? It would be amazing. I mean,
Win-win.
the old attempts to do this with energy harvesting were kind of crude. There's another famous / notorious paper in which a group made a piezoelectric belt and put it around two of the ribs of an animal at the time. And while the animal breathed in, it would stretch the belt a little, and that generated some power. But I think we've moved way beyond that.
Yeah. There was a question all the way in the back.
Sure, that's a great question.
And especially like if you missed in the beginning, he was talking about just how expensive it was to run one of the silicon creating plants. What did you say, $3 billion?
Yeah, that's just the capital.
That was like one place. So that's a great question.
Yeah, well, I will say for silicon, I always keep saying silicon is cheap because that one of those factories puts out several $1 billion worth of product a year. So you're amortizing that cost over huge. So I wouldn't say silicon itself is expensive. Getting into the business is tough.
Yeah.
And that's it. And cost is a great question and one that's been examined in some detail. And really, it depends on what you want the electronics to do and how you make them. So printing is one way that one can imagine scaling to reduce cost, because especially non-critical printing operations can be very inexpensive. And so you mentioned J&J, for example. I know there's been quite a bit of work looking at product authentication and product use validation. So there's a big issue with counterfeit drugs and counterfeit medical supplies on the market. And putting active electronics is one way to create something at a relatively low cost, which would be very expensive to then forge and duplicate, because you can build in, for example, react them. So can you make, for example, drug packages that can be read wirelessly, or make blister packs which will tell you how many of the units have been used, report back if somebody is compliant with taking their medication, things like that. And also there's been work looking at syringes, syringe use, being able to map the trash in the hospital and to say what the cost was and do inventory tracking. So I think that identification authentication is one very exciting near-term area. The other area that I showed a little bit of stuff on is making large area sensors for healthcare type monitoring. We're big and silicon electronics are small. A lot of things that we'd like to map, pressure, blood flow, the movement of various muscles, need large sensors. And if we're going to make those out of silicon, we're going to be paying for a whole wafer, and that's just too expensive. Moving to thin film techniques and printed or hybrid techniques allows us to push that down.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Right there.
Ken Anderson, Geek. I'm just following up on that. A lot of the examples that you gave were related to healthcare applications. Is that because the opportunity is greatest there? Is it your personal interest, or where your funding's coming from? Or
Yeah, actually, well, it's a mix. But you got to go where the problems are, right? As an academic engineer, we're great at making stuff, but engineering is about solving problems, and the healthcare folks have the biggest problems. Their toolbox. I wouldn't say their toolbox is limited, a huge and deep toolbox, but they've maxed it out, and so they're looking for new stuff and new directions to go. And so I would say that's the reason to look there. Yeah, that's what we do as engineers.
So before we go, John, just give us a sense of look into your crystal ball or silicon crystal, whatever. 1 year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what could we what do you think we could expect to see?
Oh wow, that's a great and tough question. I'd say 1 year from now, not that much is going to change. We've seen, for example, some new thin film systems come out. Many of you, I'm sure, have, for example, organic light emitting diode displays in your phones.
Seen that,
That's been 20 years in the making, but it's finally hit about 2 years ago when Samsung decided to spend the big bucks to make it real.
We went to CES and saw the curving OLED screens, and I was like, what the hell is OLED? And now
There you go.
it comes together.
So that's the near future. As we go to 3 and 10 years, what we're going to start seeing is a lot more ability to create sensors that do stuff that you don't even notice. So we started to see this a little bit. For example, the new Kinect has a depth camera in it. I mean, this is something which 5 years ago was sci-fi. And people buy Kinect, they dance in front of it, and magic happens. And we're going to see that with other electronic systems as well. And so there are specialized areas. Healthcare is a great one, where you know what you're getting into, and they're going to be sophisticated systems. But especially on the consumer side, what I think we'll see is more magic. So human-machine interaction, user interface, ability to tell who's in the room, how you're using a device. A lot of the systems that we're building will combine with processing power to give us that sort of seamless interaction. And so we have done an amazing job if people don't even notice. Stuff just becomes more magical because it has all this new sensing, actuation, and use capacity.
Great. John Kymissis, thank you so much.
Thank
It's
you.
like a crash course.
Thank you.
I'd say Manoush, thank you,
Yeah.
and thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Julie, for putting this together. Thank you, RGA Accelerator, for hosting us. Thank you very much, John. This was a prototype. Should we do this again?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. So any feedback, any ideas, we'd be happy to hear more about it. Do we come in at the right level? Do we, what can we do better in the future? I appreciate it very much, and I hope you guys will drink the rest of the coffee and eat the rest of the Thank you very much.